time, and you are watching Turn to the Stars. And today is May 12th, and we have a really exciting show planned for you. My special guest today is A.T. Mann from Hudson, New York. Welcome to Turn to the Stars, Tad.
Thank you, Andrea. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, it is very exciting to have you on the show, and I just want to give you a little bit of history on Tad. He is an international architectural designer, educated at Cornell University. He is an astrologist for 43 years, author of 16 books on astrology and other sacred material, a Mandala artist of sacred pictures, and developed the theory of lifetime astrology. And again, as I said before, I really want to welcome you and say what an honor it is to have you as a guest on Turn to the Stars. And
thanks very much, Andrea. It's a pleasure.
Just to fill in our audience, I want to give a little history. I met Tad at a lecture and seminar I attended last year in May in Cape Cod, and I walked away with a whole new vision of astrology, and I am genuinely fascinated by his story, by his work, and overall inspired to continue to educate all in my path about the gift of astrology. And Tad, I was wondering, can you share with our audience your story?
Yes, absolutely. I was trained as an architect, and I worked in New York City and Rome in the 60s. And in the late 60s or early 70s, I discovered astrology. And again, because of my visual background, I really felt as though it had a lot of validity, even though what I read about it at the time didn't particularly impress me. And particularly, I was interested in the whole idea that it seemed very static and very flat. It's like similar to the way people talk about it today. Like, I'm a Leo and you're a Virgo, and that will describe who we are. And of course, first of all, we're much more complex than that. And also at the same time, I realized that one of the issues of astrology at that point was what is the mechanism by which we're able to actually look at a person's life? And I realized that actually the missing component was time, which is absolutely central. So I developed a system based upon my discoveries back in those days, and by reading books about not only about astrology, but also about the new physics and about biology. And I think you'll understand by listening to a little bit of this that the system I created is actually a very interesting, synchronization between a lot of these particular ideas.
Well, I want to say how inspiring it is, because the theory that you presented, which I learned from you, is something that I value and find priceless. It did stir up, exactly as you said, it stirred up the interest which I felt was sort of stale in astrology at that moment in my evolution of my education in astrology. And I just want to show something real quick on the screen. It's actually the contact information and a whole bunch of information on Tad. There it is. We have his phone number, we have mobile text. It has all kinds of information on this page about Tad. He has a numerous unbelievable track record, Tad, I would have to say, with what you've developed. It's phenomenal, and I wanted to share that with our audience because it's unbelievable. I've looked at most of all of these things and am just so inspired to continue to see where this is all going and where we're all going as in humanity as a world. And which leads me to the next piece of this is, why do planets in our solar system hold memories that register in time, and what does this mean to an individual?
Well, the way it works, and the great breakthrough that happened to me back in those days, was a book I read called The Theory of Celestial Influence. And the book said basically that our solar system the sun does not just sit in space with planets revolving around it in those elliptical or circular orbits, but rather the sun is moving around the center of the Milky Way galaxy at a phenomenal rate, which is actually now estimated to be something in the region of 1 million miles a day. And so when you try to imagine what this could look like, it produces the diagram that I'm sure you're putting up on the screen. And that diagram means that the sun moving through time and space makes a kind of electronic imprint.
Yes.
And that imprint creates a series of nested spirals. And if you look at the bottom of the diagram, you can see that the central filament is the sun, and then Mercury is a very tight spiral around it, and then Venus is a slightly less tight spiral, and then the Earth and the rest of the planets. And I call this the spiraling solar system. And what was most interesting to me about it was that instead of looking at a birth chart, at someone's birth as being one moment that represents the whole lifetime, I realized that actually our life is a whole process. It's a chunk of that spiral, starting not only at the time you were born, but actually you can track back to the time you're conceived. And so going back to the time you're conceived, which is when your mother and father make love to create you, astrologically, the sun is your father and the moon is your mother. And so that creation act of the sun and moon coming together not only signifies your own conception, but it's a metaphor that describes your creativity. It's about gender issues. It's about your transcendent process, about the integration of your psychology, and even your sexuality. So this dynamic is really a powerful movement, because it says, instead of looking at your life as something static that's given, it's a process in time that's continually evolving. And that process is interesting because when you look at the image above it is the spiraling DNA spiral, which is in every living cell. And the idea that Colin presented in this book, The Theory of Celestial Influence, and I've carried on in my work, is that the spiraling solar system in the macrocosm, the large world, is a similar shape and pattern to the DNA molecule in every cell. So there's a resonance, which means in physics an exchange of information instantaneously between what happens in the larger world is echoed in what happens within us. So in a way, we all carry within every cell like a little receiver that's picking up on these cosmic energies. And my astrology technique is very simply a way of interpreting the significance symbolically of this connection between the major world of the spiraling solar system and the inner world of DNA, which actually determines not only how we are, how we function, but also where we've been and where we're going. So it's quite a powerful image, and I've developed this in many of my books. The last astrology book was actually called A New Vision of Astrology, and it really does specifically talk about this dynamic, which I've been working with and using in my astrology for the last 40-odd years.
Well, you know, Tad, I have that book right in front of me, A New Vision of Astrology. I'm showing it on the screen right now, and you can see how well loved this book is. It has about 30 different tabs of paper in it where I'm really concentrated on, and which leads me to, and there we can see that really, really well with the camera. I got this book the minute I left your seminar, and my daughter has loved it very much as well. She's a young student of astrology, 17 years old, and which leads me to the next question is, how is astrology a way of decoding our genetics?
Well, the way it works is that our genes are actually a pattern that is an integration of what we inherit from our father and what we inherit from our mother. And again, in the astrological metaphor, we talk about sun signs, but actually the moon sign is just as important because the two work together. So sun and moon are male and female, they're spirit and soul, and they also represent these two genetic streams that come together when we're conceived. And the way I decided to start integrating them was based on, again, another idea from Rodney Collin, which is that there's a kind of clock of one's lifetime, that you can create a circular image of a person's life process, beginning at conception, going to birth, through childhood, all the way up until your current age, and ahead into the future for the length of your life. And when you look at this image, I realized that by laying this image over a typical astrological horoscope that shows, all of the 10 planets, including the sun and moon, that you can actually see a pattern of your life process from conception through gestation, which is when your physical body is created within your mother, all of the impulses that she feels and thinks and actually goes through during the gestation process is very deeply transmitted to your body as a set of inherent patterns. Some people believe that these patterns are patterns that come from previous lives, but obviously they represent particularly inherited patterns like, in the past, before DNA was discovered, the only metaphor one could use was a kind of reincarnation principle. So it represents an inherited set of traits, but they're also, of course, qualities that we inherit from our local past and even from our distant past. And so this process is fascinating because I can then talk about people's lives as this very complex process in time. And that process in time, again, is interrupted by planets that occur at certain ages which affect us in very particular ways. It's like whenever the sun register shows the time in your life when you're primarily affected by your father and his energy. And when that time registers at later stages, it may indicate important relationships with men in general. It may represent that masculine dynamic in you expressing itself, and so on. And in the same way, when the moon registers, it represents your strongest contact with your mother. It represents also your connection to women in general, to your emotional life, and so on. So the whole idea is that we're creating this pattern in time that uses all of the planets of the horoscope, and they unfold in a very particular sequence. And as you know, Andrea, by using a little wheel that has dates imprinted around the outside of it, it's possible to actually describe when events happen throughout your lifetime.
Yes.
So it's a fascinating process because in a way it combines genetics and the new physics and astrology, which is an ancient art.
It sure does. Tad, I think I shared with you, I took that little wheel that you gave us during the seminar, and I took Photoshop and I made it fit the astrology program I use, the birth chart. So I absolutely love it. All my students love it. I have to say that your theory is, I have seen it work 100% of the time when we have the exact time of birth. And what John has on the screen right now is the list of the lifetime dates, which includes the chart. And I was wondering if you could share with us some information about that particular graph.
Well, if you're looking at the lifetime astrology model, that it basically shows like a clock face, and the conception inception point is in the upper right at around 1 o'clock on the clock face, and that upper left quadrant represents your gestation. And these are influences that happen while your mother's carrying you. And you might think that they're not significant, but they're extremely powerful, simply because they represent very deep urges and instincts. Like, for example, I've done many horoscopes where the mother really had to consider whether to have a child or not. And so it often indicates a principle of being slightly threatened on that very deep level by women in particular. So it can represent qualities that are very deeply hidden within us. And if you begin to understand them, not only do you have the benefit of just knowing that they're there, but actually you can work on them psychologically. You can begin to work with them in terms of your religious beliefs or your attitudes towards the world or meditations or things of that sort. And then it continues through the lower part, which is childhood, which are a whole set of emotional patterns that come into being, in the time that you spend within the family. And then eventually on the right-hand part of the chart, you're going into maturity, and, the 5th and 6th houses are like between 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock on a clock face, and they represent teenage years and college and things like that. And then you move into the upper right of the chart, and it represents your latter years coming up to your current age and projecting it ahead into the future. And what's interesting about this map is that, as you know, you can just basically see when in your life particular influences happen. Like, if Mercury represents how you think, then by knowing the sign that Mercury's in and the time that it registers, it actually shows you, how your mental patterns came into being. Was it at home in the family? I mean, do you think like your parents? Or was it something that you came into the world carrying that's unique to you? Or was it something that happened relatively late in life? I think the timings of these influences is really powerful, because most astrologers don't even think about the chart in this way. So the reason I call it lifetime astrology is that it really does show these dates and these times. And, in one of the diagrams I've given you, not only shows a typical chart, but it also shows a list of dates that can be generated by computer. By just putting in the time, date, and place of your birth, a program like WinStar or Solar Fire or Sirius are programs that have this lifetime model built in. So it's interesting because you can basically see by looking at a list of dates in your life when these significant times happen. It's actually very good for beginning astrologers because it really doesn't require any real calculation on your part. Rather, it just shows this amazing pattern that we live through in the course of our lives. In a sense, we're telling a story of your lifetime. When I do readings for clients of mine, which I do all the time, I'm basically just walking them through their life process and introducing them to their parents, when they were conceived, when they were born, in early childhood. What are the influences that they passed on to us and why? It actually brings a whole life into perspective, I believe. And I think it's actually a very critical process because instead of being this static pattern, it really represents these series of changes that happen to us throughout our lifetime. It's really fascinating to work with, as you know.
It sure is. It really is. And Tad, can you talk about junk DNA for a bit? Because I find that so fascinating.
Yes, it's a fascinating topic and something that I discovered along the way because, although I took biology in school, I had to learn quite a lot about the deeper biological mechanisms. And I began realizing something very unusual because during the 70s and 80s, they began decoding the human genome, the human DNA. And I thought that they were decoding the entire process of information, which is billions and billions of these, of these formulae. And the point of it is I realized that the actual DNA that they consider to be responsible for creating and maintaining our body was less than 1% of the DNA in the human genome. And the reason this is the case is because they discovered that there were these deeply strange and repetitive patterns in the other 98 or 99% of the DNA that they basically called junk DNA because they didn't know what it did. And I realized, because I had had, quite powerful spiritual and psychological studies, as well as very interesting experiences back in the late 60s and early 70s in America as well as in India, that I began realizing that we carry a much deeper and more profound code within us than modern science acknowledges, and that the junk DNA is like what Theosophists call the Akashic record.
Yeah.
It's actually a history of all life, and that it's also associated with what the psychologist Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. And he described the collective unconscious as a history that we carry within us, within every cell, of everything that's happened in history, and that some of us have access to it through dreams, through psychic experiences, through opening ourselves up to the inner world, through meditation, through some religious belief systems, and so on. And that we actually have access to, I gradually began to realize that this actually was like the foundation of our lifetime, and it was actually describing our previous lives. And I developed a system I called the Divine Plot, which is the name of a book also, that actually describes this entire process. So we actually carry within us not only the influences of this lifetime, but we carry our entire collective history within. And this is, again, a fascinating dynamic and a fascinating idea that really doesn't exist in astrology otherwise, and certainly doesn't exist within the scientific world. But it basically shows that we have this grasp of all history within us, and that it's available to everyone. It's not in some mysterious vault in the heavens. It's available in you. It's within your physical body, your emotional body, your mental body. In fact, I think those are programmed in the same way that our physical body is. In fact, they're only now discovering, after I formulated this concept more than 35 years ago, they're only now realizing that this junk DNA does really represent deeper patterns that we carry within, that actually modulate the genes in a very, very profound and sophisticated way. So in a way, it's interesting because these astrological ideas actually predated a lot of modern genetic thinking. It really is quite a powerful metaphor, and I think any of you who are interested in discovering this, might be well advised to either take a look at my website or actually get a copy of The New Vision of Astrology and see what's going on, because it really is, it brings a whole other dynamic to astrology, as you know, Andrea.
Yeah, I have passed this on to all my students in the adult education program. I talk about you all the time, Ted, and your name is becoming well known up here in New England. And
thank you.
And well, when you find something that resonates with something that speaks to your heart, and you know it's truth, you pass it on. And we have been doing that up here. And one of the things that's so fascinating about what your theory of lifetime astrology is that I'm also a practitioner of shamanism, and I do a journey with my group, with my class, that we go into past lives, and what the chart holds and the answers that the birth chart holds with your theory of lifetime astrology, we have uncovered these same scenarios through these past life journeys, and it is all perfectly in alignment. So it is so exciting when with this theory of lifetime astrology that you've brought forward, and so I so appreciate it. I don't think that there is any person who should learn astrology without learning this, without learning what you're teaching and what you've brought forward, Ted. And I thank you for, I'm very thankful and grateful for this. And I know we're almost to the end of the show here, but I did want to, just for one moment, if we could just flash on the screen. It looks like we have about 3 minutes, but I'd like to flash on the screen the calendar that you developed in 1976 and 1977. If you could talk for a minute or so about that.
Sure. Well, back in the 70s, I moved to London in 1973, and I was a single parent. I raised my daughter on my own. We lived on a houseboat on the Thames in London. And during those years, I formed a publishing company with some friends. We called it Phenomenon Publications. And one of the things we did was we produced a calendar every year. And this diagram is a calendar for the year from the spring equinox 1976 to the spring equinox 1977. In fact, it's a very interesting diagram. It's called a mandala, which is a circular way of showing information. And mandalas are common in Eastern philosophy, in the I Ching, in Chinese religion, in Hinduism, in Buddhism, and things of the sort. But this calendar is very interesting because it combines our Western calendar with Hebrew calendar and Islamic calendar and the Chinese calendar and the Hindu calendar. And it turns out that it really brings us into closer contact with nature. If you're interested in finding out more about this, look at my website, which is atmann.net. And at atmann.net, under the section on design, there's a whole little link to a video that shows me leading you through the process of this calendar on YouTube. In fact, it really is interesting because this whole process of lifetime astrology leads us into really becoming closer to nature. We're brought back into contact with the natural world, with the natural rhythms and cycles. And I believe this is a very healthy and very positive advance. And I thank you so much, Andrea, for bringing this to people's attention.
Tad, and it is, again, I must say, an honor to have you on Turn to the Stars today, and we so appreciate you taking the time to talk to us up here in New England, and we look forward to seeing you, talking to you soon, and to everyone watching the show, we want to thank you all for your continued support of Turn to the Stars, and just want to remind you, turn to the stars and you will find your answers there. Until next time, take good care. We'll see you then.